Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're chalking up wins and losses for the Olympics. Well, in this case, black ink and red ink as well, with France 24's very own Elliot Richardson, Ligia Maura-Costa, who teaches at FGV Sao Paulo University, and from Oxford University, Ben Flyberg, co-author of the Oxford Olympic Study 2016, Cost and Cost Overrun at the Games. Ligia, just before the break, you talked about how the public image of Brazil bolstered by what happened. Just there was one question that came up often, which were those empty seats we saw, especially for things like athletics. Could they have done something about that? Perhaps made the cost of the tickets a little cheaper or something?
The cost of the tickets were very expensive for Brazilians. Second, Olympics is not, something that for Brazilians we really care a lot, like, World Cup. So Brazilians were really thinking about that. Third, going to Rio de Janeiro as Brazilians, as we didn't want to go to Rio de Janeiro, despite the fact that it's a beautiful city. It's the most beautiful city, one of the most beautiful cities that we have in Brazil, because of the violence, because we are going to be robbed. So it was also a challenge for Brazilians to go there. Last but not least, during the World Cup, many neighborhood countries, they came to Brazil for the World Cup. This did not actually happen for the Olympics, because I suppose the Latin American countries, as Brazil, we do not care that much for the Olympics. And without mention the scandal with the tickets from the Ireland officer that was also, maybe it also has helped of having so many empty seats during the Olympics.
Elliot, did you see those empty seats coming?
Unfortunately, I did, yeah, because I think that, if I'm right, that the cost of a daily ticket, for example, is around about half a week's wage for the average worker who lives in a favela. I don't know if that's officially correct, but that's what I've read in quite a few sources. And if that is the case, then they're being priced out, aren't they? Working class Brazilian people. And unfortunately, it was reflective in most of the sports that you could see. I think 58% of available tickets were sold on day one of the athletics, and that's normally the fulcrum of the games, or the flagship.
Ben, that pricing issue, is that the fault of the Brazilians or the International Olympic Committee?
Well, the price is decided jointly by the IOC and the organizers, but I would say that London had the same problem. In the beginning, there were quite a few empty seats, and the way you solve that is to simply give away the seats. You don't want to show the whole world that you can't fill a stadium, and I don't understand why Brazil didn't solve the problem like that. You just say, hey, a few minutes into or a few minutes before you start a certain competition, if the seats are not full, you start letting people in, even if they haven't paid for tickets. You just let them queue up outside, or you could sell the tickets at heavily discounted prices if you still wanted to sell. That problem is solvable, and it wasn't done. And like I said, London had the same problem. They solved it.
All right, the short power outage that we saw at the Maracana Stadium just before the closing ceremony may have served as, I don't know whether you call it an omen or reminder of the issues that Brazil still faces. Claire Williams has more.
This was the scene at Copacabana Beach when Rio won the Olympic bid. Tens of thousands watched the decision live on a giant TV screen. The then President Lula da Silva cried when he heard the news. The Olympics were to be his crowning achievement. 7 years later, the euphoric celebrations at Copacabana Beach seem like a distant memory. Lula now faces trial for obstructing justice. His chosen successor, Dilma Rousseff, could soon be impeached, and her replacement, Michel Temer, is accused of corruption.
While the world is watching Rio and the Olympics, nobody's watching what's happening in the capital, Brasilia. Over there, they are changing our country, and we're here without any news, except for how great Rio is.
Since Rio was awarded the Olympics in 2009, the so-called golden days of Lula's presidency have come to an abrupt end. Globally, the price of oil has plummeted and unemployment in Brazil is rising again.
There's not enough work. Healthcare is bad, so is education. We try to get by. If there's no work, we work on the streets.
This family watched the closing ceremony fireworks from their home in Mangueira favela. Tickets were too expensive for many locals in Rio.
The legacy of the Games is quite significant, but when it comes to security, considering the politicians we have around here, I think everything will go back to how it was before. Unfortunately.
The government gave Rio almost $1 billion in emergency funding to see it through the Olympics. But now the festivities have ended and the tourists are going home, old problems remain. And Rio's residents want to know what happens next.
Lydia, I want to ask you about those images we saw at the beginning of Claire Williams' report from 2009 at Copacabana Beach. It seems like a century ago when you see what's happened in Brazil since. It was at a time when Brazil had literally struck oil, right? They had found oil. There was commodity prices were going through the roof.
You know, a huge fortune of the shares of the company. Everything was booming. China was buying all the commodities from Brazil, and everything was perfect.
And you sense the bitterness of those citizens against all politicians.
That's for sure. That's for sure. And I think that this has not started this year, neither last year, and it has started in 2013. Since 2013, Brazilians are quite mad with the government in general. And so that's why we start to have, the riots in Brazil, because Brazil is not, it's not a country that used to have, riots. So 2013 riots was a beginning of something that we didn't know what was going on in the country. And nowadays we think that it's good, that it's nice to express. And also I think that as Brazilians we learn to criticize more our politicians, that we have to be alert, that we have to control. Otherwise, politicians, they are very complicated, and corruption is really something that Brazilians cannot support anymore.
But we saw that the president of the country didn't show up at the closing ceremony because he didn't want to get booed in the way he got booed at the opening ceremony. He's not from...
And he was not even booed compared to what Dilma has faced during the World Cup. So it was very light, the boo that he has suffered, compared to
Still, he didn't show his face at the closing ceremonies.
Yes, because, listen, he's not really he's the interim president. So think about it. You are hosting an international event like the Olympics in a country that has an interim president, and even though the Olympics were fantastic. So think from the other sides, so how civilized is this country and how mature it is from a democratic perspective. Because during the party, we are going to say we're going to do the party and we're going to finish that. And I'm positive that after that, on Monday, now Brazilians are already looking to Brasilia and see what's going on because the impeachment process is going to start. So, during 15 days, it was a kind of relief for Brazilians after a very tough year on Brazilians from a political perspective.
All right, reactions on the hashtag F24debate. The worst thing about Rio's Olympics aftermath is the fact that few will bother about the favelas, the pollution, and the corruption. Bent Flyvjog, back in 2013, Lydia mentioned it, there were those first big protests. At the time, it was billed by some as a protest of rising expectations of a nation that had risen out of poverty. Nowadays, we're not looking at it that way at all. And when you look at the Olympics, at the World Cup, have these been part of the problem or part of the solution?
I would say for Brazil, it's been part of the problem. You really have to question the wisdom of spending money the way you've done for the World Cup and for the Olympics when you have a country that is in the situation that Brazil is in now. But we have to remember that economic cycles move in 8 to 10 year cycles, and the Olympics move in 8 to 10 year cycles. So the phenomenon that we saw for Brazil is actually not that unusual. When a nation is up, they go for the Olympics because the economy is booming, they feel they can afford it. that's 8 to 10 years before they actually have the opening ceremony. So when you have the opening ceremony, you're more likely than not to be in an economic downturn because of the frequency of the economic cycles. That's exactly what happened for Brazil, in a worse way than for most nations, but Brazil is not the only nation who had this unpleasant experience.
Brazil's not the only nation. What's going to be Brazil's judging on past cases? When you look, for instance, Bent, I suppose the case that comes to everyone's mind is Montreal in 1976, which took decades to repay all of its debts. What's Brazil's outlook going to be on international sporting events? We heard Ligia mention how they're not huge fans of sports other than football to start with.
Well, I don't think that Brazil is going to be in the same dire situation as Montreal, because, as we heard before, Brazil is a federation and the different parts of the nation help each other. So Rio is being helped out. Montreal was not being helped out. So Montreal was stuck with its own debt and did not get help from the regional and national government. So that's one big difference. Athens is closer. You know, not a lot of people know this, but the economic crisis, the very severe economic and financial crisis of Greece actually started with the Olympics in Athens in 2004, going over budget and accruing debts. And that meant when the real economic crisis hit 3 years later in 2007, Greece was in a worse situation than they would have been had they not put on the Olympics. And that's why the economic crisis hit so hard. Again, Brazil is very different from Greece. Greece is a small economy with not many people and not a very high GDP. Total, Brazil is a different ballgame. There's a lot of people. The total GDP is high. And therefore, the economy can easier absorb the cost of the World Cup and the Olympics. So I don't see a long-run economic, very big negative effect on the Brazilian economy from these two events alone.
And Elliot Richardson, these big sporting events, you heard there Bent mentioning, watch out, economic cycles. Just because your country's doing well now doesn't mean you can afford it later to host the games. They're going to run over budget no matter what you say. Yet people still bid for be it the Olympics or the World Cup. And most notably now we're seeing Paris bidding for the 2024 games.
Yeah, exactly. I think as well with Rio, with Brazil, it's back-to-back as well, 2014 and 2016. It's a huge financial strain on the country. And I hope that Brazil can recover the debt that the Olympics has put them in. Greece certainly has, and that's the role model you don't want to take is Greece. But hopefully, I think they're right in the fact that the GDP of Brazil is high, and there's a lot of people. The economy, it's in the top 10 in the world, and I think it will recover. But I think there is a lesson there for future countries, for other countries bidding for back-to-back games in particular, tournaments as big as the FIFA World Cup.
And we're starting to see cities in referendums vote against hosting, be it World Cups or Olympic tournaments.
Yeah, we are, and I think there's a reason for that as well. And I think if you look at Japan in 4 years' time, that is a country that's got a huge infrastructure, a huge GDP. They can afford it. They've got the Rugby World Cup in 2019 as well, so that's back-to-back for Japan. But that's a country that can actually afford these games. And well, with Paris as well, Paris is a little bit different to Brazil. France is a wealthier country than Brazil. I expect Paris to be fine should it win the Olympic bids. That'll be found out next year, of course. But I think in the long run, Brazil will be okay. But I think that is the lesson that you don't want to go down is if your country is in the mire slightly, you don't want to be putting the country under massive financial strain by bidding for two huge tournaments, the biggest in the world, back to back.
Bent, do you agree? Will Paris be fine?
Yes, I agree on both points that it's not what you want if you have a problematic economy. You don't want to have to shoulder the cost for events like this. And yes, I do believe that Paris will be fine.
But let me ask you...
we do see cities...
Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I was going to say we're seeing a sort of a turning of the tide, not so much with the Olympics, but certainly with the World Cup after the huge corruption scandal that continues to rock its leadership. Is public opinion in any way, shape, or form turning against these huge tournaments? We saw TV audiences were huge for both the World Cup and the Olympics.
Yeah, in one sense, public opinion is turning against it. And that's the public opinion in the host city. So Boston, for instance, decided not to bid for the games. So did Oslo, so did Hamburg, so did Warsaw in Poland, so did Davos in Switzerland, Munich too, as far as I remember. So there's been a whole line of cities in the West and the North that decided that they don't want to host the Olympics. And I think that's a new situation. And I think it's come about because of the extravagant cost of Sochi and London. So 2014 and 2012. London was the most expensive Summer Olympics ever, and Sochi was the most expensive Winter Olympics ever. And this has scared off cities that care about their local budgets. We live in times of austerity. We hear all the time that we have to be careful about not spending too much money and so on, because we still live in the aftermath of the economic crisis of 2007 to 2009. And cities have become more frugal, so they're just not going to step into extravagant spending like this.
So listening to you, Bent, and to what Elliot Richardson said a moment ago, you get the sense that nations like South Africa hosting the World Cup will never happen again, that it's only a privilege for the rich.
No, I think it's the opposite now. It's actually the rich don't want to do it. So right now it's only emerging economies that want to put on the Olympic. And that actually concerns the IOC. So they are happy to see that Paris is in now and Rome is in. Because the IOC would be really concerned about not having developed economies bidding for the Olympics. And that's something for IOC to be concerned about. We haven't talked about the IOC at all yet, but they actually have huge responsibility for how the games are held and how much they get to cost. They basically define the criteria that the games have to live up to, what has to be there, the level of this, the level of that, the media center, the villages for the athletes, security, and so on. And therefore, they define the budget. But interestingly, they're not guaranteeing the budget. It's the local city, the host city and the host nation are guaranteeing the budget, not the IOC. So that's a very unusual situation that the organization that owns the event is actually not guaranteeing the budget of the event, but others are. And that's actually a very unhealthy structure economically.
That's such an important point. I want to put it to you, Ligia Maura Costa. The IOC encourages bidding for the games. They don't want to see just one city host, right? They want to put in their candidacy. I mean, they encourage bidding among several cities. And at the end of the day, they don't bear the responsibility for the cost if there's a massive overrun of the budget. What's your reaction to that?
Oh, wow. This is a very tough question. I would prefer to answer the other ones. I think
but as a Brazilian, how do you feel about it?
As a Brazilian, I think that maybe, the international committee, Olympic committee should, start, sharing a little bit the responsibilities and not putting a lot of pressure on the host cities or the host countries. And in view of the fact that I do not know how much money actually the Olympic can make for the committee, but maybe the committee should also be responsible, should also support, especially when you're thinking about emerging countries, because think about it, how many years we have the Olympics. It's the first time that a country in South America has hosted the Olympic Games. And I think that this is also important to promote the Olympics, to have the Olympics much closer. I can guarantee to you that in 4 years, Brazilians will be much more concerned about watching the Olympics and even, traveling to try to see the Olympic Games. So it's a kind of promotion that maybe it has to be, reviewed.
Ben Flyberg, again, this is so important what we're talking about here. People love the Olympics, and the Olympics have this positive effect on the planet. But the IOC is not held to scrutiny, it seems, because of that. They seem to be making... Do we know how much they're making off of the Rio Games?
We will know how much they're making. They're making billions of each game. They're a huge business, and they are a huge monopoly, and they are an unregulated monopoly. Governments should start thinking about regulating the IOC. They have it too easy, and you can imagine if you were having a house built and you could specify what you wanted, but you didn't have to guarantee the budget. Somebody else would do that for you. You can imagine what kind of house you would ask to have built That's what the IOC does, and they shouldn't be allowed to do that.
And whose job should it be to regulate them?
It should be the hosting nation. So maybe, you know, the G7 or G20, whatever, a large group of countries that have or will host the Olympics and that are able to set down rules that most countries could agree on.
The host nation is not that strong to negotiate with the international committee.
I like the idea of that, actually, having a kind of a committee to regulate the governing body which is holding the event. So like a committee to regulate FIFA for 2 years ago, a committee to regulate the IOC. And I think if, for example, if a lesser economy is going to bid to host such an event like the Olympics, I think there does need to be a lot more regulation, unfortunately.
All right, Elliot Richardson, I want to thank you. I want to thank Luigi Mario Costa. I want to thank Ben Flyberg for being with us from Oxford. Stay with us. Our Media Watch segment is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, François. So just
congratulations on those Irish rowers, by the way.
Oh well, they were quite the media storm, weren't they? They beyond their sporting prowess, I think their media appearances got a lot of attention. All eyes on the medal count, of course, François, as the Olympic Games come to an end. This tweet congratulating the French delegation with 42 medals, a record since 1900. The European Parliament doing a medal count, François. Huge congratulations to all the European winners and participants at Rio 2016. You did brilliantly.
So if the EU was a nation, it would be...
It would have won several times over. This is what the EU keeps arguing. If, you know, economically, sporting-wise, etc., we would be on top of the world if we just joined together. Except what did they do here? They omitted the British medal count. And the British, of course, Team Great Britain came second in the medal charts, which led some to comment on that tweet a little bit further down. At Europarl, you can leave the UK medals off that list, as we in the UK are very proud of our own funding, etc. And I think somebody else said that this is one of the reasons why we left the EU, this sort of behaviour, these sort of tweets. Anyway, politicking. European sneers take shine off Great Britain's medal haul. This is an article in the Financial Times pointing out that Germany's Frankfurter Allgemeine newspaper singled out Team GB's spectacular success in cycling, which it said has led its rivals to wonder if there isn't something fishy going on with the Brits.
It wasn't just the Germans, by the way, Elliot Richardson. The French were furious.
Yeah, they certainly were. I think, yeah, there was a lot of animosity, I think, a lot of questioning about Britain's medal tally. But, I would like to add to this, it has slowly risen over since Beijing. There was a big medal count, I think 47 in total in Beijing. It went to 65 in London. I think it is the amalgamation of a lot of years' work from back after Atlanta, when Britain performed so poorly back in 1996. But yeah, a lot of questioning from a lot of countries.
Well, apparently in Poland, they're looking at, the sports minister is calling for the country to copy the British approach since Atlanta, as you said, when just one gold medal was won. But what has been criticised in El País also is this sort of un-Olympic attitude, whereby a no-compromise approach to funding, which allocates money to sports with a realistic chance of earning medals, and withholding money from disciplines that failed to meet the sports target, the medals target rather, in the previous Olympics. In any case, that's just one angle.
Is that a fair cop? Has there been sort of a focus on this sport, perhaps we can win more medals there so it gets more money?
I think so. I think that's valid. Yeah, I think Britain have certainly targeted rowing and cycling. I mean, they're the two. Cycling was never a stronghold of Britain before Beijing, and then all these medals started coming in. Rowing certainly has been for a long time, and I think they have ploughed a lot of money into rowing. I think that's a fair argument. Yeah, I mean, countries do target certain sports.
I mean, the thing is, this is professional sports, so I suppose it shouldn't be surprising that there's going to be a certain element of targeting success, etc. It's not amateur. It's not amateur. In any case. Moving on to the telegraph.co.uk, they've put something interesting online here. Countries with the most medals per person. So let's just flip it all up. And who would have won? Actually, Grenada, followed by the Bahamas, followed by Jamaica. We know why they're featuring so highly, Mr. Bolt amongst others. New Zealand, Denmark, Croatia, Slovenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Hungary. So nowhere Great Britain, nowhere France, Germany, US, China. So there you go. It's all unfair anyway, isn't it? It's stacked.
That is a great
It is. Makes you think.
Yeah.
What else do we have? At Tokyo 2020, here we come. Of course, there was that bizarre moment with Mr. Abe appearing out in sort of Super Mario mode. We're looking now towards 2020. All very weird.
What do you think of your reaction when you saw?
It was a Super Mario. I didn't get it. I was just waiting to have, Pokemon or something like that.
A little bit of dignity, please, for heads of state. Anyway, with the Olympics over, we'll finish with this, New York Times, 6 former host cities worth visiting. Of course, this has been one of the big talking points about the Rio Games, whether or not this has been a benefit for the city or not, whether it's been money well spent or not. And they're looking here at where it has worked out well and where it has worked out less well. Beijing was famously seen to have spent way too much and sort of not necessarily the best investment. Barcelona, on the other hand, the beaches that are so, what would you say, symbolic of Barcelona today, used to be an industrial dumping ground and were redeveloped as part of the preparation for the Games. Barcelona's profile soared after the Games. It was the 7th most visited city in Europe in 2014, so perhaps Rio will be hoping to have a legacy somewhat like that one. International prestige, yes.
Okay. Well, James Creedon, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.